Namaste, Sandeep. Welcome to the Atharva Forum.
Hey, namaste. Thanks.
Great to have you.
Thank you. Likewise.
So, for the viewers, in case you're not aware, Sandeep Balakrishna is a prolific writer and thinker. He is the author of two books, Tipu Sultan, the Tyrant of Mysore, and The Madurai Sultanate, A Concise History. And he has translated S.L. Bhairappa's iconic novel, Avaran, into English. Sandeep is also the founder and chief editor of the Dharma Dispatch. And today we will be in conversation on duties versus rights, the Sanatana Dharmic conception versus Western democracy. So, Sandeep, you have been vocal throughout your writings on this issue of the Western concept of democracy, which is, as we know, rooted in the Christian worldview and values. So, it will be great to have your thoughts with us here today.
Thank you. Thanks for the generous introduction.
You're welcome.
Right. Okay.
So the first question is this, that it is said that the contemporary Western democratic culture is a rights-based culture. And this, of course, as we know, is the culture and jurisprudence that has been adopted in India since 1947. And it is also said that India's indigenous dharmic culture is a duty-based culture. So is this one of the major differences between Indian and Western culture? Could you set the context for our readers, for our viewers?
Oh, yeah. Certainly. So just, it's a nice way of phrasing it. It is not just one of the major differences, but it is the most fundamental difference between what you just described as rights versus duties-based society, jurisprudence, politics, and the rest of the things. So basically, the Western model, the Western worldview, like you said, is rights-based. So where does this rights-based thing originate? It originates in Christianity, or at any rate, the Abrahamic core theological beliefs, which these worldviews basically looks at the physical world as something that has been made available by an all-powerful, jealous male god for the sole purpose of its enjoyment primarily by men. So it is a right that man, the human male, has over this entire world, that it is for our consumption, basically our consumption. Now, I think in the 1960s, there was a very influential paper. I forget the name of the author of that, but it was a fairly academic kind of a paper which basically set the tone for what we today know as the overarching American form of consumerist capitalism. That paper basically derived its premise from the same Christian worldview, which says the world is meant for man's exploitation and enjoyment. I mean, you can't enjoy any physical thing unless you exploit it. At a very, very basic level, unless you exploit something, like if you want to make furniture, you have to exploit the tree by cutting it, right? So eventually this will creep into their society and culture, and for good or bad, for the last at least 150 or 200 years, this has been the dominant view in which people perceive the world, and which is something that we unthinkingly adopted in our constitution at the expense of something that is far more deeper, far more spiritual and noble, which is called dharma. One of the meanings of dharma is duty. I think that should set the context in the overarching fashion.
Right. So what you're saying is that the rights-based culture is essentially a consumption-based and exploitation-based culture.
Absolutely.
Right.
Because rights are not natural. I mean, there is a lot of talk about natural rights. What are natural rights? Yeah? I mean, we will just do this like a conversation. Give me a list of 3 or 4 main natural rights that we get. Without us as humans doing anything to earn that right.
Right, the right to exploit nature, for example.
No, that's not a right. The moment you say you exploit, you have a right over something, there is a sense of what you call ownership. The natural right is perhaps, speaking very loosely, the right to life. That is
Yes,
perhaps the only natural right which we share in common with all other animals as well. Right?
I agree.
The right
Yes,
to live, the right to live, the right to live, safely, securely, without having to, kind of look over your shoulder whether other people will attack you or take away your stuff, steal your stuff, and things like that. But that is jungle rule. But even in a jungle rule, there is a certain thing called jungle law, right? Which
yes,
means you will not kill just for your pleasure.
correct.
You will
Yes.
kill only because you have to, survive. Which again brings you back to the same thing that I said. The right to live is only natural right.
And maybe the right to share the resources of the world with others.
Well, that doesn't become a right. That is when you slowly start getting into spirituality. When you say
Okay.
the right to share, what does share mean? Share means that you reduce your ego by your sense of possession and ownership. You reduce that bit by bit, and then finally you arrive at the conclusion, the realization, not conclusion, the realization that the world does not belong to you, that you're just one small speck in the entire cosmos, the entire creation, and that the best thing you can do, if you can't, if you know, it is better to remain silent and not cause harm to others than, have these grand schemes that will eventually cause hurt and damage to other people. At a very fundamental level, these are some of the points of origin of our dharmic system.
Right. So, would you say that this obsession with rights has made people forget their duties towards society? Is that what we
Absolutely.
see? Is that what we see in Western society today? And is it something that we are
Absolutely.
seeing even in India
Hmm.
today?
Hmm? Sorry, can you repeat the last one?
So, is that something that we are seeing even in India today?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a consequence of blindly adopting this Western kind of an approach of the what you call the rights-based worldview, where you have constitution. I think I wrote in my piece that there is no chapter in our constitution that deals with fundamental duties. You have fundamental rights, which is fine. I mean, there is a lot of thought has been gone into that. I'm not discounting that, but that pales in comparison. That is at the most third or fourth grade compared to a system which is governed by duties. Because when a system is governed by duties, it essentially means that it is incumbent upon the individual to realize the duty within, and not clamor for rights without earning it. So the more you perform duty, the notion of rights will vanish from your mind.
Right. But in a duty based culture or tradition, such as the Indian Dharmic culture, are
Mm,
certain rights not implicit? For example, in the Dharmic tradition, it is our duty to avoid harming or hurting anybody in any
mm,
manner whatsoever, except for
mm.
self. So, does that not automatically confer upon everybody the right to life, liberty, security?
Well, I mean, that's a very loose way of looking at it. Look, when I say a duty based or a dharma based system, what it simply means is this, yeah, that your propensity, the natural human tendency, is to not keep quiet. It is one of constant action. I mean, it could be as simple. When you say you're earning a livelihood, what does it mean? Ultimately, it means that you're eating, right? Other things come later. Food, clothing, shelter. Out of that, will you tolerate, hunger? If someone asks you, I'll give you a beautiful mansion, Dhirubhai Ambani's mansion, I'll gift it to you, but you have to go hungry throughout your life. How long do you think you will survive? What will you prioritize? Right?
Yes.
So that said, even in a duty-based society, as long as we are alive, it goes without saying that in our quest to survive, we will cause damage. We will cause hurt to others. But two things are there. One thing is the hurt that we cause should not be consciously done. And two, there should be a certain sense of debt. So the concept of rina and dharma cannot be separated.
Okay.
that there is a beautiful conception in our thing that which basically says that for every single breath that you take, the entire universe works overtime to keep you alive. So when you realize this very, very profound, basic, fundamental concept, you automatically develop a sense of gratitude towards the universe. That it is not just you whose life, or you're living your daily stuff, work, and all that. Something, forces other than you, are working overtime to keep you, to help you do what you're doing.
And
So
what forces are these?
the expression of this gratitude is known as rina. In other words, it's a debt.
It's a debt, yes.
Yeah, it's a debt. So this is a whole. I'll call it a triad of Rita, Dharma, and Rina. Rita is a cosmic order. These are the external forces you mentioned.
Right.
What is known as a cosmic order, that whatever invisible force that maintains some semblance of balance in this world. So as far as possible, we have to work throughout our lives to discharge some bit of our rina to this cosmic order. To maintain.
And does this rina also come into the context of karma?
Well, discharging karma in the traditional sense that we know is also one way of discharging rina.
Right. So these are interlinked.
They are very interlinked. Yeah.
Okay. Right. The next question is this: that India's dharmic culture has, over thousands of years, given rise to various forms of governance. For example, we have had Rajtantra, which is monarchy, which was the most common form of governance. We also had Ganatantra and the Ganarajas, which was the republican form of government. So could you explain in detail the differences and commonalities, if any, between Rajtantra and the democratic model of governance that is currently in place in India?
Well, I mean, it's a huge subject, but let me try and condense it as best as possible. Monarchy in Indian sense is vastly different from monarchy in the Western sense, where the king had a divine right to rule. That
Yes.
he was above question, beyond question, all that. But in Indian conception, and where did he get this divine right to rule? From Christianity. So to that sense, in that sense, religion, and I mean, this again brings you to the secular thing, that separation between religion, church, and state, and all that. So in India, this was never the case. The king was bound only by dharma, and he recognized a power higher than him, unlike a king in the Western conception. Right? So that higher power was not another person; it was a precept. It was dharma, basically. So that is one part of it, and as long as he was aware of it, he retained his position. And Raja Shastra also gives provision for the people to overthrow an adharmic king. This not many people will mention because it is politically incorrect, but it is a fact. There is a provision whereby people can get together, they can form assemblies, whatever it is, and there are a lot of instances. I think the Pala and the Sena rule, the first Pala king was coronated, or the first Sena king, I forget which, but one of the two. The first ruler acquired power as a result of a overthrow of an existing king who was completely useless.
I see. So we have had examples in history.
Oh, so many.
I see.
So that provision is there. It's not like a revolution. Revolution is a concept alien to India.
Yes.
It is a completely alien concept. Okay, that is one. Now you mentioned something about republican kind of thing. You can't exactly extrapolate or draw a one-to-one parallel between what is known as the Greek republics, which is where the concept came from. But yes, we had Janapadas and Ganas and all that. They were loosely federated republics, to use that word. They were loosely federated republics which had their own systems of self-governing, mutual dependence, give and take. They had their own private armies, and well drawn borders and all that. It went on for time. They had proper elections for different positions like finance minister, home minister. You had that concept, and famous you example is that you had Shodasha Mahajanapadas. So that is one big representative of what you call the Republican kind of system, but it was not sustainable in a country like India. Now, when I say India, you look at undivided India.
Yes.
The northwestern part of India that we have lost to Pakistan, Afghanistan, has always been geographically, naturally a very, very hostile region. Half of your daily battle is with the forces of nature.
Yes, yes.
Extreme cold, lot of dry regions, mountains. Really, even today with all this modern technology, we find it difficult to live in those regions. You're talking about a time more than 3,000, 5,000 years ago, right? So, as such, it was not sustainable because those regions were also the gateway to invade India.
Yes.
And there were, it's a fact of history that once you attain a peak of prosperity, societies, economies, politics has to degenerate and there has to be a downfall and a churn again.
It's a cyclical thing, isn't it?
It's a cyclical thing, absolutely. Any civilization, Greek, Rome, whatever, some of them survive, others don't. That's all. And they make way for new cultures and civilizations to emerge from that. So, that being the case, this was not sustainable because together, none of these ganas, by maintaining their strict independence, strict border independence, territorial independence, they eventually began quarreling with each other, which made it easy for Alexander to come in. So that is why Kautilya, he figured out that this was a fatal weakness which will, destroy the integrity of the entire country itself. I think you must have seen this, some of those speeches in Chanakya serial.
Yes.
Which is all entirely true, actually, historically recorded. So he said, for such a system, what is the first, definition of how do you keep a country intact? By securing its borders, right? National security. So this kind of border skirmishes, if they keep happening, a strong foreign guy will capitalize on that, right?
Yes.
So, which is why Kautilya said enough is enough. This has to be under a strong centralized authority, but a loosely federated republics, which would maintain. That is the other great feature of Indian political system, is that no matter who conquered whom or who fought with whom, at the local level, at the micro granular level, at the official dumb level, military victories did not mean a sudden uprooting of everything that had come down for centuries together.
Very true, yes.
So this concept came in only after Muslims invaded India. So that is what Kautilya thought. This is the only way it will work, and the foundations that he had laid down, it can be seen even today in some areas of our administration. If you are interested, you can refer to McKinsey manuscripts. It's more than 8,000 pages, several volumes, but you can make the connection directly to the Mauryan Empire.
Right. So you mentioned that the Ganapada system was not sustainable because there were too many internal issues. So what do you think, is there any parallel between that time and what we have today, this federated system that we have in India today? Is there a parallel between that and what we have today? And is a federal system ideal for India, or in your opinion, what would be a better system?
Okay, I mean, every system, whether what is better, the choice, there's always a trade-off, right? But this is a fantastic question. Thank you. Because what we inherited from the British, we did not dismantle was an exploitative system, basically. It was meant to oppress. The laws were meant to oppress and not to govern.
Yes.
When will you govern? When you feel a sense of belongingness, right? If I take over your house, will I look at you as my inferior, or will I be benevolent for you?
It was an oppressive,
Right.
extractive system,
It
wasn't
was
it?
extractive system, right?
Yes.
So most of these laws, when we kind of inherited that, we didn't dismantle the fundamentals of that exploitative system. Instead, it was like this: a new oppressor took over from the old oppressor and took the oppression to made it
Higher
into an art
levels.
form.
Yes.
It was made into an art form. It survives even today. So anyway, so the big mistake we did was to divide the states on the basis of language. It is still a thorn in our flesh, because until you were divided, India was divided into states on the basis of language. Language was never the issue. The issue was always about territory. Why would a king wage an unprovoked war just to extend his empire, right?
Yes.
And it was legally, Shastras permitted it, as it did everywhere, except that every victory of expansion was known as a yajna or a yaga. So the ultimate and the root meaning of yajna is to share.
I see.
It is not sacrifice. It means to share. So the ultimate, even a military victory, was known as a yaga or yajna, whose ultimate goal was dharma sthapana, meaning establishing a kingdom which upholds dharma. So we forgot all this. So language as such was no issue. Like my ancestors came somewhere, I think, from Andhra, and I have as much connection with native Andhra as I have with, say, Poland or something. Culturally we are all the same, but when you talk strictly in the purview of linguistic divides, it's as remote as Poland. So how far can you trace back your antecedent? So languages were never, on the contrary, languages were encouraged by every king. Krishnadeva patronized what? Not just Telugu or Kannada poets. He patronized Sanskrit poets, he patronized Odisha poets, Bengali poets, a lot of these guys. And he was no exception. He followed the same tradition that his older kings had laid down. So why are we fighting? Unfortunately, now we are fighting on the basis of language, although that fight is reduced over the years. But it was in the 70s up to mid-90s, or at least till 2000, language-based fights were huge, especially in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, or Tamil Nadu, Kerala, all these guys, and Karnataka, Maharashtra. This happened only because you solidified these linguistic differences. Now, take the case to illustrate this more, in a slightly detailed fashion. Take the case of people living in the borders of any two states or three states. What is their exact mother tongue? It is arguable, right?
It is, yes.
Right. Like for someone living in Kolar, which is on the border of both Andhra and little bit Tamil Nadu also, there is a predominance of Tamil and Telugu. So it's arguable. And on the other side, it's the same thing. Lot of Kannada, you find a lot of Kannada speaking people in Hosur, which can as well easily be incorporated into Bangalore. So this was a big mistake, what you said, but I think I missed the question. Yeah, the federated state, yes. So you have a strong center, a strong union, which should essentially have coercive power over the state to keep them in check and make sure that they behave and not hold the center to ransom.
Yes.
On whatever issue. On whatever issue. So unfortunately, by dividing India on the basis of languages, the power of the center eventually began to thaw. It began to loosen. So does that answer your question?
It does, yes. So what I find is that we have adopted the system of governance of a small island in the Atlantic Ocean, and we have applied that to a subcontinent-sized country. So that is clearly a mistake, isn't it? I mean, the system that evolved over there has no relevance here. And still we have adopted it wholesale. So that is a real big problem. And like you said, we have never decolonized. We have never changed the system at all. So that's one of the big issues. Now you mentioned democracy, right? You mentioned that there were elections in the Ganapadas. So today,
Janapadas.
Janapadas, yes. So today, everybody thinks of democracy as being Western in origin and conception. You will find leftist and Western historians claiming that democracy originated in the West, in ancient Greece, to be precise. So, is that claim correct and factual, or did democracy actually originate in India, especially in the Janapada system and its precursors in the Saraswati Sindhu phase of our civilization?
No, actually, what these guys claim about their democracy originated in the West is largely true. The democracy, in the sense that the world understands it today, the system of voting where technically you can also be the PM, I can also be the president, right?
Technically.
So yeah, technically, that system originated and developed in the West itself, because it didn't have, although that notion was present in a few areas in practice in the Janapada system, the ruler, the head of state, was ultimately called Samrat, which means emperor, right? So although it's arguable, although the position of Samrat was not hereditary, it was also hereditary in some cases. You get enough examples for making a case for both arguments, for both instances. But the claim these guys make that, democracy as we understand it today did not exist in India is largely right.
Well, similarly, we could say that the university system that we had during, for example, Nalanda or Takshashila, for example, was very different from what we have today. And yet, those were universities, weren't they? The way they functioned, the way they functioned was very different, perhaps. But these were still universities. So similarly, let me give you a different example. For example, if you see the ancient cities of Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, etc., of the Saraswati civilization, you will see that the biggest buildings, the grandest buildings, are public buildings. The communal bath, the assembly hall, the granary, etc. There are no rich quarters and poor quarters. There are no castles or palaces or mansions. All dwellings are more or less similar. So does that indicate that ancient India was an egalitarian civilization? And does it indicate the existence of some form of proto-democracy?
Well, I mean, because the research is so less and so recent, you can't make a definitive claim based on just what is available. And, you can't argue from absence of evidence, right? So because you don't find the remnants of castles or palaces, you can't say that they didn't exist.
True.
Now, for example, let's take a recent case, okay? Vijayanagar Empire. What we have now is just ruins, right?
Yes.
And a lavish guy like Krishnadevaraya, it is not, I mean, it is unimaginable that he didn't have a grand palace. But has it survived?
It has not.
Yeah. So does it mean that it was not there?
It does not, yes.
So, for example, let's take an even more recent case, Chitradurga. Okay, that was ruled by a Palega, the one lineage of Nayakas, okay? A largely fort-based civilization with a town at the foothill. So the palace was there on top of the hill, but nothing of it survives today except some pillars. And just looking at that, the tourist guide will point to you that, this was the royal granary, this was the treasury, and this was where, this was the queen's quarters, but nothing survives. But it doesn't mean it was not there.
Agreed, yes. Yeah. Right. So most probably the democracy that we understand it as it is today probably came from ancient Greece, right?
Yeah.
Okay, next question. We have just finished watching Srimad Ramayana and the Mahabharata during the current lockdown period. So what do the Ramayana and the Mahabharata tell us about democracy or proto-democracy in India, the way kings were duty-bound to abide by the voice of their subjects?
Yeah, so, good question actually. It's not just Ramayana and Mahabharata. They became popular because these concepts of what you call democracy and, what is the duty of the king to a subject, when you narrate that as a story based on a great person's life and all the other characters that come in contact with him, right? Then it appeals to you. That lesson will be drilled down into your at the level of consciousness far more effectively than reading a theory textbook. So fundamentally, what the statecraft and the method, kingly duties, because it's called Raja Dharma. It's not politics, right? It is Raja
Yes.
Dharma. So meaning a king has no private life, right? So every action, every speech, every behavior, conduct, the king was supposed to be the model that the citizens had to look up to.
Yes.
Because remember, apart from fighting wars, he had to give justice, right? And justice comes from wisdom primarily. Unless you're wise, you cannot deliver adequate justice, right? So you have several examples. I'm sure you have also read these stories, like Vikramaditya's throne, right? Like even when a robber, even when a murderer would go and sit on one stone, which used to be Vikramaditya's throne long back, he would suddenly be transformed into a very wise man.
Yes.
What do all these stories indicate? So it indicates how dharma had to be discharged in action, in practice by a king. So several threads are there in this. So the primary duty, once you became a king, you had no personal life. We have covered that. Which means if you had to give up your family for the sake of dharma, justice, whatever, you better well do that. So this is the lesson of Sita Parityaga by Rama. That, not even a single black spot on the king's character. He's not just Rama, he is Maharaja Sri Rama. So the Maharaja takes precedence over Sri Rama, the person and the husband and the father and brother. Because it's nice to read dharma, all these things in theory. But how is it shown? It is shown only in practice by a person who lives it. You have to embody it. So one part of Raja Dharma is a king is considered as Prajavatsala, which means he should be a friend. He should be affectionate towards his subjects, to the last guy in the, in the lowest village. You had to have that kind. That's why, king is my father and all that. It was, we read all that in our stories in the childhood. At least I read. Maybe our generation read. So what does it mean? It indicates this one-to-one bond of affection, which does not need any authority. So where there is affection, आपका बात चल जाएगा, right?
Yes, indeed.
So that, and because a king discharges Raja Dharma properly, Praja Dharma was also discharged according to their own capacity and their own profession and everything. So this is again comes back to what is known as the duty-based or dharma-based society. No external laws at the best, they can at best be barbed, fences. But you can't permanently guard against that guy who comes with the electric cutter, to cut that fence. How long will you keep extending, fortifying it with external laws? So this is, the simplest way you can explain what is known as a rights-based and duties-based versus right-based systems.
So when you mentioned duties, what you are indicating is that there was a hierarchy of duties. For example, you have Raja Dharma, which takes precedence over everything else for a king.
Yes.
And similarly, for a person also, there will be a certain hierarchy of duties.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay, next question. We know that India is a very ancient civilization that gave rise to a number of diverse philosophical traditions and worldviews over thousands of years. There was a great deal of philosophical pluralism in India before the foreign cultures invaded our space. So my question is that from which philosophical tradition or traditions did India's
Mm.
duties-based culture evolve? Did it evolve from a specific philosophy or a specific text or a group of texts,
Mm.
or did all of our philosophies place an emphasis on
Mm.
duties and responsibilities over rights?
No, okay. So see, these things happen. Societies and cultures evolve as a collective over a period of time after making mistakes and learning from them. So it's not like, one fine day when Rishi opened his eyes and said, "Okay, I got this whole revelation, and I'm going to, from now on, India will be a duties-based society." No, it didn't happen like that. So the primary thing is that almost everything in our culture can be traced back to the Vedic corpus or the
Right.
Vedic literature, which is a fount of everything, which is the origin of all of Indian culture, right? So one of the primary things that the Vedas say is that you don't damage this universe. The word Rita is mentioned several times in all Vedas. Is that, I think in one Taittiriya Upanishad, it says, uh, as part of your Svadhyaya, make sure that your Rita consciousness is part of your Svadhyaya, meaning your self introspection, which has to be done on a continuous, if not daily basis. So, from a sense that you are just a small speck and that you owe a non repayable debt to the universe, from this small strand, and I'm not saying this is the only strand, but it's an important central kind of thread. From this, uh, it gradually percolated to different areas of life, and basically they said, you do your duty to the best of your ability and do it with honesty and integrity. Rest will follow. Don't be bothered whether somebody, your neighbor, did not do it. You do it.
That's an interesting
Right?
point.
Yeah, this is it. So, and most texts, I mean, all whatever pluralism you mentioned, right? I mean, I don't hold a brief for all these new words. What is a pluralism? And ism simply means some kind of ideology, basically. It's not even philosophy. So I don't give much of credence to these isms. So a point is, ever diverse sects, every single sect or philosophy or school which originated from India shares all these common characteristics. Dharma, Satya, Rita, Atma, Purusha, Bhagavan, all these things. Some of these characteristics are common across all sects here. And all of them were born in India. Anything that came outside do not have these notions. You can take it from me like a formula. I'm willing to debate anywhere.
Right. So our constitution today does have some fundamental duties, right? But those are non-justiciable, which means that you cannot be taken to court for not carrying out those duties.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. So it is called, there is a word for it. It is called obedience to the unenforceable.
Right. So in the past, in ancient India, was there any system, whether it was legal, political, or whatever societal, that made this that enforced the carrying out of duties? So, for example, if you did not carry out some duties, did you face any consequences, or was carrying out your duties optional like it is today?
If carrying out duty, like I said, duty is an internal attitude that you have to imbibe on your own, or it comes by virtue of being born in a certain culture or family environment or community environment. Okay, now that is out of the way. I'll address this question. Fantastic question, actually. In the past, the way duties were enforced was very simple. That if you don't do this duty, you will incur sin. तुमको पाप लगेगा, तुमको भगवान श्राप देगा. But now we are all geniuses. No, we don't need any restraints. We don't believe in either punya or papa. Right? So that was one very effective way of doing it. I'm not saying I advocate it, but that kept the society healthy and relatively free from the kind of daily chaos and fighting that we see today. It was a very effective way. The other thing was the community ostracization. You did not do a duty, to that extent your participation in community was cut off. right? So there are different ways of transgressing duty. For example, violating a certain kind of conduct. What was the common punishment given at the level of village, or a large village or a small town? Ostracization. Keep them out. You have to live outside the village. Nobody should help them for anything, whether good or bad. Right? This is in recent memory, and I think this practice exists even today in some remote villages in India. I don't know to what extent, but this is how it was enforced. Make sense?
So there were societal consequences, not legal consequences, but societal consequences of not carrying out your duty.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
absolutely.
Right. Now let's talk about right for a minute. As we know, the Western world has been by far the biggest violators of all kinds of rights. There were times when more than 10% of England's population consisted of slaves.
Yes.
Slavery was rampant in the Western Empire, in the Roman Empire, in Greece, everywhere.
Yes. Yeah.
It existed until the 19th century at least.
Yeah.
The status of women, for example, has been abysmal in the West. Women were burned alive as witches. In some parts of Europe, women did not get the right to vote until 1991. And segregation, racism, homophobia, apartheid existed well until the 20th century. And even today, Black lives don't really matter. So my question is, when did this rights-based culture and jurisprudence actually originate in the West? And does the Western world actually believe in rights and actually practice the concept? Or is it simply a virtue signaling tool and a stick to beat others up with?
Well, I think the rights-based discourse, I can't put an exact date to it because I don't want to go wrong on recorded facts, but there's no one point of origin to this rights discourse. Like in India, it also evolved over a period of time, where the West began to become civilized after a millennium of Christian darkness, especially Western Europe, right? So once they began to get civilized and they recognized that church was all basically bullshit, superstition, then they had to find a non-church alternative, which means you had to reject what they call as spiritual or scriptural authority. So when you reject the scriptural authority, which was in force for more than 1,000 years, you have to find an equal, if not better, source of authority, which was eventually based on what they call the rule of reason and whatever, the whole Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, that those three major milestones. So this rights-based discourse eventually evolved over these three stages, and not didn't happen just at once, but I think which is that famous essay, an essay on the rights of man. I don't know who wrote that. I forget that, but all these guys, John Locke and Hume, and all these so-called reformist thinkers, enlightened thinkers. From there, it percolated, and once democracy superseded or replaced monarchy, the rights-based discourse, which again, I mean, you can't invent something which is already not there in your culture for a prolonged period of time, right? The rights-based discourse why didn't it arise in India? Because the notion was alien to us. It was not homegrown. Rights-based discourse had a home in Europe because of Christianity, right?
Right. So they substituted one thing for another.
Right. So Buddhism or non-violent, sects like Jainism and Buddhism could only evolve in India. Right. How many systems of non-violence do you see in Abrahamic faiths? No, none.
None.
Why? So this is a fundamental worldview. It stems from a fundamental worldview which looks at the world as a playground for exploitation and enjoyment. I mean, you spoke about women's rights, right? That again comes from the Christian, doctrine, which says that a woman is only 1/6 a man's left rib or something.
Yes, indeed.
So this kind of nonsense basically, and they have the gall to call us superstitious. So I mean, forget all that. So eventually, that's how the rights discourse also came into jurisprudence in their system. It didn't come from outside. It had to. It was homegrown basically, but it just evolved out of, by discarding the religious trappings that it had earlier.
So it's curious that even while they were discussing rights and all that, from the Enlightenment period onwards, from the Renaissance onwards, they were still carrying out exploitation of other places. They were doing colonialism. They were practicing slavery. In the U.S. Constitution, when they said that all men are equal, it was omitted that the black man is not equal, or the red man is not equal.
Segregation was in practice till 1960s.
Till the 60s, yes.
So that's 50 years ago, very recent.
So they don't really practice what they preach, don't they?
No, they don't. Yeah, fantastic point. Actually, see this at one level, you have a rights-based discourse for England and for the colonizers in their homes. Those who are colonized don't have any rights.
Precisely.
They're worse than slaves, right? So why hasn't any book been written about the awesome contribution of Indian soldiers in the First and Second World War outside India? Because Indian soldiers were not Indian soldiers. They were slaves.
That's what they were.
When you strip off the fat, this is what it boils down.
So there were two parallel systems. The rights were for the colonizers and there were no rights for the colonized. That's essentially what it is.
Yeah, totally.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's a point that everybody should realize, because people don't realize this. They think about the West as this place where everybody has rights. It's not really the case, isn't it?
It's not true at all. It's not true. You can't make, good point, See, one thing that the West, especially America, has been good at is projecting its larger than life image. Even when the number of Indians migrating to the US was very low in the 70s, what was the image of America typically? Wide roads, clean roads, manicured lawns in front of every house. There's a swimming pool in every house, and free sex, all these fast cars. So we used to have this whole notion that it is a heaven on earth. That where everything, the entire society is perfect.
Yes.
But what was happening in 60s and 70s in the same period in America? Race riots, protest against Vietnam, Watergate.
And much more.
Yeah, much more.
And even today, when they talk about social justice, for example, this social justice is reserved for certain categories of people. For example, even today in the US and in North America as a whole, the indigenous people have very few rights. Right? They live a second-class existence.
And they have been wiped off. They've been put on dole.
Essentially.
But essentially, they've been put on dole. Monthly the money keeps coming. It's a great way of social engineering. You have to give it to them. Keep giving them money, and what do they spend it on? That money? Do they spend it on improving themselves? No. They drink or they take drugs or do whatever and generally waste away their lives. And the same state that gives them doles will extract it in the form of Mediclaim or health insurance or whatever.
So it's a very unequal system. So that's what people need to realize. Yes.
Yeah. They have elevated it to an art form. That's all I can say.
Now let me ask you a slightly contrarian question. So the Indian worldview has always been that our dharma is Sanatana, which is eternal. However, today, right now, we are living under a Western system, under a Western constitution and Western laws. Since 47, we have been ruled by a one-party, autocratic, often oppressive system, right? And our institutions, our organs of government are all deeply colonized. For example, you yourself have written that our constitution is the very antithesis of the civilization that it was supposedly meant to protect.
Supposed to protect.
Yeah. Yes. So under the current system, for example, if we made the right to a speedy trial a fundamental and unalienable right, it would actually drastically improve the lives of millions of Indians. So my question is this: that are rights necessary and useful? Is it something our culture has somehow missed in some sense? Or do rights assume relevance only in the context of Western culture and Western systems of governance?
Okay, I think we can do a separate podcast on just this topic, but I'm going to summarize, some 50 threads you've kept here. So, fantastic. So I'll just summarize it in a different fashion.
Sure.
Now, when you say right to, first you said social justice, right? The moment you qualify the word justice, it stops becoming justice.
True.
Justice should stand. It is independent. You either have justice or you don't have justice. Simple. It is a total binary. You can't qualify it with social justice. You can't qualify it with animal justice. What next? Abhijit justice. Huh? So I'll form a political party which is dedicated exclusively for getting justice to Abhijit. So once you acquire political power, you will write Abhijit Penal Code. So if you stretch this, you have to stretch this argument to its absurd worst. That's the only way. I mean, these things used to be normal. That you can't qualify the word justice.
And
So
today
you
the
put
reverse is
social
normal.
behind it. Yeah.
So isn't
What
this
was considered?
isn't this
So
the
that is
genesis
one.
of identity politics?
I mean, it is one of the outcomes of identity politics.
Right.
Yeah. So that and speedy justice. Then what is that? The other point you are saying. What was that? Yeah.
So my main question was that do rights assume relevance only in the context of Western culture and the Western systems of governance?
No, you can't make a blanket statement like that. See, the point about justice, okay, is that how was justice delivered in traditional duties-based Indian society? Justice was delivered at the smallest unit at the quickest possible time in the most satisfactory, equitable fashion, which
Right.
essentially meant the village panchayat. Rarely would a dispute from a village come all the way to the king. He was both the king and he was both the prime minister and the chief justice of Supreme Court. That was the key. So it was very rare that a guy in a village was not satisfied with the justice done to him, and he had to knock on the doors of the king. So what have we done? We have done the reverse.
We've done the reverse, yes.
Because this whole endless loop of appeal till the Supreme Court. So what do you mean judges getting corrupted? Yeah, buying out judges, politicians having files on judges, giving sexual favors for promotion. What is all that? Right. So when you're conscious of your own duty, and this duty consciousness also happens in a society which is largely dependent on people. Now we have replaced people with lifeless things like machines, basically systems, right? And you had what you call a societal structure to support this kind of duties-based lifestyle, to kind of simplify it. So you not only imported an alien Western jurisprudence. How many of our Supreme Court judges can read, write, or understand words, basic words in their own mother tongues? Right.
Very few, I would say.
Okay, forget that. Now, in a civilizationally important case like Ram Mandir, right? I remember reading in some, the whole judgment report in some media. It says that the judge was so impressed with the erudition of that famous advocate, Mr. Parasharan, right? He could quote from our shastras and our various agamas on the spot, impromptu. So, logically speaking, the judge should have been able to understand this and remember the citations. He should have been better informed than Mr. Parasharan.
True, yes.
So your judiciary itself is deeply colonized, completely deracinated. So let's live in the real world, right? In the present world. So we are living in this kind of a world. So I don't think, even the notion of rights versus duties and all this debate in this context specifically, it has no meaning, I think.
Yes,
so
agreed.
the correction has to be done somewhere else.
The correction has to happen at a different level, essentially.
Yeah, Yeah, we are only, kind of doing multiple surgeries, but the virus is somewhere else.
We're doing cosmetic surgeries right now. The
Yeah,
real
that's all.
deal is somewhere else, isn't it?
Somewhere, yeah, absolutely.
Yes, true.
Mm.
Okay, let me ask you a question about animal rights.
Mm.
So, animals such as living organisms, jiva jantu, like we say, etc., they have almost no rights whatsoever in the Western jurisprudence and in Western culture. Now, do humans have any duties or responsibilities towards animals in the dharmic culture and tradition? In other words, do animals have rights in India's dharmic culture?
Well, I mean, there is just one word for that, which answers all your questions. It's called Bhutadaya. Bhutadaya means compassion and innate compassion that resides in all of us. Or if it doesn't, you have to recognize it, awaken it towards all beings, whether living or non-living. So that is called Bhutadaya. So this is why the notion of worshipping stones and monkeys, even dogs is an avatar of Shiva.
See,
Okay, buffaloes, living, non-living, rivers, seas, oceans. It comes from this Bhutadaya. That's the one word answer for you.
so we see divinity in everything, in all of nature.
Yes.
Perfect answer. Okay, one more question, the final question. To recap, how would you explain the importance and relevance of duties in the modern 21st century world to a teenager or a 20-year-old person who has been immersed in Western culture and values?
I am the least qualified to explain this to a to a modern teenager. Primarily because these things can't be taught at that age. You can catch them only before the age of 8, but even that is becoming dangerous. That difficult now. I mean, what is all these dance reality shows where children are being so rampantly sexualized?
Yeah, that's terrible, really.
Yeah, how to explain something like this to them? For that, parents should be educated enough to do this job. They encourage their kids to go on Star TV and all these nonsense dance shows.
So, what is the best age at which you can inculcate these values?
Right from childhood, yeah. I mean, as soon as your kid begins to speak and walk and whatever thing, for heaven's sake, I keep repeating to whoever listens to me: do not send your children to mainstream schools. Do homeschooling, please do homeschooling, and drill it into them, no matter what, that being born Hindu is the best thing that could have happened to him or her, your kid, and it is the most superior and the most sublime dharmas, cultures in the world, as compared to any other thing. By saying Hindu, I mean all dharmic faiths, anything that was born in this land.
That's a fantastic piece of advice. Yeah, it does. The most important advice is that of homeschooling.
Yes.
Keep them out of the mainstream system, which completely ruins them.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so this brings us to the end of this session. Okay. Thank you very much, Sandeep, for your brilliant and enriching insights.
My pleasure.
Yeah,
I hope I answered all your questions satisfactorily.
Absolutely. Actually, we could talk a lot more, I'm sure, but we have a time constraint, so we'll stop here.
Oh yeah, we have that.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and I'm sure the Atharva Forum viewers will stand to gain a lot from watching this conversation and from reading your work.
Fantastic work. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Namaste.
Namaste.